The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back, my baby dolls. Another episode of Genesis coming your way. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we are going further into the book National Pastime, U.S. History Through Baseball. Last time we let off, we had Marty Babicz on the show, and we talked about the 1920s and the Negro Leagues. Today, we're going to try to focus on the Great Depression, baseball in America, and then if we can, we'll hit Jackie Robinson and the Civil Rights Movement. And I don't know if we're going to actually reach that point, because with Jackie, I think when people look at his life, and he did die, he was young, he was 53 years old in 1972, he did more off the field than on the field for civil rights, and his legacy continued straight through the 60s, right up until the time of his death. And he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. He was upset that his other teammates didn't join him. He was a broadcaster, first African-American broadcaster for Monday Night Baseball, Sunday Night Baseball, vice president of the Chock-full of Nuts Coffee. And again, he gave testimony in the Kurt Flood case in 1970, a couple of years before he passed on. So there's a lot to talk about today. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, who is our fearless leader, our producer. A lot of shows coming on, folks. In fact, we're expanding right now. I'm co-producing a show with Ralph, and I'm going into the producing business, and it's taking a lot of time besides my book that I do, and of course my talk show that I do here on Genesis. But I'm having a lot of fun with producing, speaking to sponsors and getting onto Sports Byline, and that's going to happen hopefully by June 1st. We're gearing up to have renowned author Peter Golenbach as co-host, along with co-host Lenny Randall, who has been a marketing guru himself in the radio business for the last 40 years. He was with the Mets and a few other teams, and after that he went into marketing and radio. He gives a lot to charities. He's a pleasure to work with. I see on Facebook he's always tagging me in his posts whenever he gives money. And not only does it do it domestically here in the United States, but he does it all throughout the world. So people send me emails or what, and I can't even understand the language. So, hey, it's funny because 3 years ago I did a show on the Tomato League, Italy and baseball. And as you know, Italy is just one of those countries that are a soccer haven. And baseball to them is like soccer to us in the United States. It's not that prevalent. And so he was the first one to be interviewed in his home in USA. We did it on Skype. It was his first interview across the water, across the pond here in the United States. And the next day, I'm getting stuff from like Rome and Venice and all Parma and all these places that he was on my show. And you know what the thing is? I had to get my in-laws to translate it for me because I couldn't read a lick of Italian. So, I mean, I married into them, but I couldn't read it. And I was a celebrity and still am in Italy, and I got to go across the pond myself one of these days. You just never know. That's the beauty of this show. But we're going to be focusing on the Depression today. I love history. As you all know, I have my master's in history as well. And we're going to be focusing on one of my favorite periods, not the greatest periods, but the FDR administration. We're going to go through the Hoover Dam and the Hoovervilles and, the Dust Bowl and just everything, Murphy's Law happening around the world and especially in the United States during this time. The stock market crash, the demise of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and baseball just barely surviving the Depression, if you will. And then, again, if that wasn't bad enough, losing all their players to the Second World War, and attendance continuing to decline until the players come back. But we're in for a great show. And Marty, he's at the University of Colorado here, and he's a co-author, Thomas W. Zeiler, and wrote a fantastic book here. I cannot say enough about the book. I'll even plug it before I even get back on. This is about the third show I have Marty on, and again, you know, anyway, he's all the big shots. They're in the history department there, University of Colorado in Boulder. The Sewell Hall History and Cultural Residential Academic Program, Communications and Society Residential Academic Program, and the History Department, and all these big shots. They got somewhere to go and someplace to be, and I work out of my humble home here in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. Without any ado, welcome to the show, Marty.
Thank you, Ian. I'm glad to be here.
It's always good to have you back. The Great Depression, here we go. Stock market crashes. Philadelphia Athletics are one of the powerhouse teams here. What's going on in American society?
Yeah, well, the Athletics had won 3 straight American League pennants, 1929, 1930, 1931. But then the Depression hits, and Connie Mack, you know, unlike most other owners who have other sources of income, like Jake Rupert, who owned Knickerbocker Beer, or Wrigley, who owned the Cubs but also owned Wrigley Chewing Gum, Connie Mack just owned the Athletics. And with the Depression, baseball fans can't afford to go to as many games, so attendance goes down across the major leagues. The total attendance drops by about 40%. And with this, Connie Mack doesn't have the income to sustain his winning team. So he's forced to start to get rid of some of his players, and he gets, over the course of the Depression, he gets rid of 4 future Hall of Famers. Catcher Mickey Cochran was traded to the Tigers in 1934. First baseman Jimmy Fox was sold to the Red Sox in 1936. Left fielder Al Simmons was sold to the White Sox in 1932. And pitcher Lefty Grove was traded to the Red Sox in 1933. So he's got this great team that he put together. They won 2 World Series and 3 pennants, and he just gets rid of all these stars, and the Athletics will fall out of contention, and they will not be a contender for 40 years, 2 cities later, before the team starts to contend again.
Now, how about this? Right in the heart of the Depression, right in the middle of it, we got the first All-Star game playing at
Kaminsky Park.
Kaminsky Park. Let's talk about the first All-Star game.
Yeah, there was a World's Fair being held in Chicago in 1933, and the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune, a guy named Arch Ward, thought, well, if Chicago could host the Fair of the Century, why not also host the baseball game of the century? And so he organizes this all-star game between stars of the American League and stars of the National League. And the game was so successful that Major League Baseball decides to hold it every year after that. And actually the all-star game in 1933 was one of a number of gimmicks that baseball was adopting to try to lure in fans because the attendance was suffering so much. And this is something in minor league teams still do it all the time. And you see even during prosperous times when a team that is not very good and therefore its attendance is not very high might resort to gimmicks to bring fans in when they can't bring fans in because they win. Well, during the Great Depression, major league teams resorted to all sorts of gimmicks to try to get fans to come to the game. And the All-Star game was really one of these gimmicks to get fans excited about baseball.
You know, Chicago, again, 40 years before, in 1893, I don't know if you ever read the book The Devil in the White City by Eric Sherman.
I have. Yeah, I did read that book.
You know that a decade after the fire pretty much burnt all of Chicago down, it rose from the ashes, and Chicago was in a race to beat New York City pretty much as the as the largest, most glamorous town in the United States. And the book is a fascinating detail, not only of the building and the architecture that went in to make the World's Fair a spectacle for the ages, but of course what is labeled as the first serial killer in Dr. H.H. Holmes as running around the fair. It is I love that house of horrors that he built. He just fired the construction crew every time they came to a dead end. All right, don't worry about it. We're going to hire another one. So he can literally build secret passageways in there and have gas into rooms and torture chambers. A fascinating story. And here we are talking about Chicago again, but there is a dichotomy here, Mon, because some teams suffer, like the Dodgers, and we'll get into the Dodgers, but some teams, like the St. Louis Cardinals, because of Branch Rickey's theory, which we spoke about, and the farm system, the Cardinals are able to thrive. What's going on here?
Yeah, and that's because Branch Rickey discovered an inexpensive way to bring in talent to the Cardinals. He invented the farm system in the 1920s. And with that, he's able to get players cheaply and not only get players to stock his team, but he's got so many extra players, he could either sell some of these players to other teams to bring in income, or more likely he could trade away his starters because he knows he's got somebody in the wings as good as that person or better to replace them. And other teams would love to take a starter who's established, and so he brings these players in. He can keep them cheaply because he signs them for almost nothing, and with the reserve clause, he doesn't have to really pay them that much. And so he puts together a winning team, and the Cardinals win the 1930 pennant, the 1931 pennant, the 1934 pennant. They win the World Series in 1931 and 1934. And he's put together, a great team at a very low cost. In fact, his 1934 team will be nicknamed the Gas House Gang, led by Dizzy Dean, who won 30 games that year, and his brother Paul, who won 19. There's an interesting story where Paul Dean pitched a no-hitter in the second half of a doubleheader, and Dizzy Dean had pitched the first half. And Dizzy Dean liked to brag to reporters, and after his brother pitched the no-hitter, Dizzy Dean said to the reporters, "Well, I would have thrown a no-hitter too if I had only known Paul was going to throw one in the second half of the day." But it wasn't just pitching. He had offensive players too. He had Frankie Frisch at second base. He was sort of a rarity because he was a college-educated player. He had gone to Fordham. He had Pepper Martin at third base. He was a really fast player. He had Ducky Medwick in left field, a future Hall of Famer who would win the Triple Crown in 1937. So the Cardinals were really good at a very low cost, and so they were one of the dominant teams during the Great Depression, although the guy who built the team, Branch Rickey, by the end of the decade, he'll be lured to Brooklyn.
And, it's funny because whereas the St. Louis Cardinals thrived during this period, I think my hometown of Brooklyn, the Dodgers personified literally how the hard times were, and you sum it up great. I'm going to let you talk about it, but it's where Casey Stengel really comes in the 30s and manages this team that's just an inept. If you take a look, I don't know in your research if you took a look at all the newspaper cartoons they had of the Brooklyn Dodgers well into the 50s until they won the World Series in 1955. They always had the drawing of the unshaven bum with a butt, a cigar butt, ripped pants and the hat, just like you would see in a 1930s film. And I think these Dodgers represented the times.
Oh, absolutely. And the Dodgers were unusual for New York City because both the Yankees and the Giants were thriving during the Great Depression. They drew in enough fans. They're in a large enough market. The Yankees win 4 straight World Series in the late 30s. The Giants win a couple of pennants in the late 30s. They also win the World Series in 1933. And so you might think, well, New York is exempt from the Depression until you cross the East River and realize the Dodgers were in very big trouble. The team was teetering on bankruptcy. In fact, they had their phones shut off by the phone company because they couldn't pay their phone bill. And the icon that would come to represent them would be the bum. The Dodgers sort of took pride in that. Fans called the team "dem bums" in their Brooklyn accent. And the Dodgers at some point in the 40s will hire clown Emmett Kelly to be their mascot. And Emmett Kelly's personification was as a bum. So the Dodgers will embrace this idea. In fact, and they will continue to embrace it until they move to California. And then the Dodgers organization will notify the local media in Los Angeles, do not call us bums anymore. But in Brooklyn, they sort of took this persona, and like I said, the team was on the verge of bankruptcy. They couldn't pay their phone bill, and they Brooklyn Trust Company, the bank where they owed $500,000, was coming down hard because they were having trouble paying it, and the team will contact the National League president, Ford Frick, and will say, hey, we have some trouble here. What can we do? And Ford Frick will say, well, I suggest you bring in a new president and general manager, and bring in Larry McPhail, the guy who had been the general manager of the Cincinnati Reds. And so McPhail is going to come in as the general manager of the Dodgers in 1938, I believe, and he's going to turn the team around. In Cincinnati, he had adopted one of those gimmicks. He started holding night games because during the Great Depression, a lot of people can't afford to go to baseball games, and those that could often had day jobs. So if you play night games, you can bring these fans in who have a job, who have an income, who could afford to go. So he installs lights at Crosley Field in Cincinnati, and the Reds are doing this. So when McPhail moves to Brooklyn, he installs lights at Brooklyn Field. And then something magical happens at the very first night game at Babicz Field. They're playing the Cincinnati Reds, his old team, and the pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds that night is a guy named Johnny Vandermeer, who a few days earlier had thrown a no-hitter in Boston against the Boston Braves. And this is Vandermeer's first start since his no-hitter in Boston. And Vandermeer throws the second no-hitter. In the very first night game in New York City, a pitcher throws a back-to-back no-hitter. And, you couldn't have scripted it better than that. So you get this idea, come to Babicz Field, magical things happen. McPhail also puts the Dodgers on the radio. And the Dodgers were part of an agreement with the other two New York clubs where they agreed to stay off the radio because somebody in New York is always at home. And so if there's a game on the radio, the fear was people won't go to the ball game. You won't go to Yankee Stadium or you won't go to the Polo Grounds if you could hear a team on the radio. And so the Dodgers, the Giants, and the Yankees had this agreement: we're not going to put our games on the radio. Well, McPhail pulls the Dodgers out of the agreement. He brings in the radio broadcaster that he had in Cincinnati, a Southerner named Red Barber, who had a very talented gift for broadcasting. He had a Southern accent. He had a down-home style. He had homespun language. He said certain phrases that hit home, like if a fight would break out, he would say, "We have a rhubarb on the field." Or if the Dodgers had a wide lead late in the game, he might say, "The Dodgers are in the catbird seat." Just unusual homespun terms. And so by putting Red Barber in the broadcast booth and putting the Dodgers on the radio, the Dodgers are starting to get an audience throughout the whole New York area. And they're getting a jump on both the Yankees and the Giants because those teams aren't on the radio. And all of this stuff is making the Dodgers more popular. In 1937, the year before MacPhail took over as general manager, the Dodgers drew less than 500,000 fans. In 1938, they drew 2/3 fans. In 1939, they drew over 900,000 fans. In 1940, they drew almost 1 million fans. And in 1941, the Dodgers win the National League pennant, their first pennant since 1920, and they draw over 1 million fans. So MacPhail turned the team around, a team that had been on the verge of bankruptcy, and what he did is he made the Dodgers the premier team in the National League, and ever since he took over control of the team in 1938, right up until today, the Dodgers are the most valuable team in the National League.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? All these gimmicks, I learned, especially in your book, that the Dodgers tried to change the color of their uniforms and their trim and their caps to green. What the heck was that?
Exactly. That was before MacPhail took over. In 1937, the Dodgers tried this attempt to draw new fans. They went to a bright Kelly green cap, stockings, graphics, which was not a traditional baseball color in those days, and in fact, right up until the early 60s when Charlie Finley changed uniforms in Kansas City, baseball teams tended to wear bright white uniforms at home, gray uniforms on the road, and the caps, the stockings, the sleeves, the graphics were either blue, black, or red. And so Kelly green caps and stockings and sleeves, was sort of shocking, and the Dodgers did that to try to attract attention. They're not the only team to do things like that. Other baseball teams are adopting colorful uniforms to try to draw fans. The Philadelphia Athletics put gold trim on their uniforms. The Pirates put a pirate's head on their uniform. And in Boston, the Boston Braves did something even more drastic. Because the Braves had been a lousy team and had been so for such a long time, and with the Depression going on, fans can't afford to go to many games, and so people in Boston were tended to go to see the Red Sox. The Braves decided to try to shake their losing image by changing their name, and in 1936, they started to call themselves the Boston Bees rather than the Boston Braves, with the idea that the Braves were losers, the Bees are winners. But, of course, the Bees didn't do any better than the Braves did. And after about 4 years as the Boston Bees, they quietly renamed themselves the Boston Braves in 1940.
And it's interesting also, you mentioned in your book, and I really never thought about it this way, but I knew that Babe Ruth went to the Braves, and I knew that he went to the Dodgers. And what I didn't realize, or what was really never mentioned before, was that he was being exploited to get people into the stadiums.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things baseball teams did to try to bring in fans is if you can get a famous name, people might pay to see you play. So the Yankees had no more use for Babe Ruth after 1934. The guy is getting old. The Yankees have all these other stars on their roster, or people coming up. Obviously, Joe DiMaggio will join the Yankees in 1936. So after the 1934 season's over, the Yankees sell Ruth to the Boston Braves. And the Braves use him because, here's a famous player. But Ruth is old. His talent is gone. He's slow. And he'll retire in the middle of the season. He'll realize that he can't quite do it anymore. And then the Dodgers in 1938 will bring Babe Ruth back as a coach. And you think, well, maybe fans will come to see a coach. That doesn't really sound that inviting. I mean, who's going to go see the coach? But what the Dodgers are going to do is they're going to not only put Babe Ruth in the first base coaching box, they're going to let him take batting practice. And it's, it's unheard of for a first base coach to take batting practice. But by letting Babe Ruth take batting practice, what the Dodgers are doing is allowing fans to see this guy swing the bat, especially fans who may have never seen Babe Ruth play. And so, that's something to buy a ticket just to see this guy swing a bat. And although Ruth is old and slow, he could still swing the bat, and he could still hit the ball, especially in batting practice, out of the ballpark. And so they're using Babe Ruth to sell tickets. And Ruth is doing this because he's hoping to someday become a manager, which he'll never get that job, but that's what he wants. And he'll realize by the end of the season that he's not going to become a future manager of the Dodgers and that they're just exploiting his name. And so when the 1938 season is over, Babe Ruth is going to quietly retire rather than continue the humiliation of just being a gimmick to bring fans to Ebbets Field.
Let me ask you this question. Again, we talk about Casey Stengel. He managed the Bees as well during this time as well as the Dodgers.
Exactly.
And it's again, they always saw Casey as a clown, especially with that bird in the hat trick he did way back in the teens, so he could generate laughs. But here, his genius doesn't get out because, you don't have the best players. It's in the middle of the Depression. In fact, one newspaper person thought solely of Casey Stengel that when he got hit by one of those railway cars up here in Boston. I don't know if you've ever known that story.
I never heard that story.
Yeah, he got hit by a trolley up here in Boston, and the newspaper was so down on him. Boston.
Oh, is that are you going to tell me the headline said, X-ray of Casey Stengel's head shows nothing?
Yeah, and then they said, well, it's unfortunate it didn't kill him, because the Bees was so bad. And, that's what they thought of Casey. And when and I'm going to segue into this, into the 1936 to 39 Yankees, is when you look at the dynasty of the 49 to 53 Yankees, where they won 5 in a row, Casey Stengel did not have. The Yankees were not picked once to win the pennant, nevertheless the World Series. In 49, he had 3/4 of his team on the injured reserve. DiMaggio didn't play from April all the way until around August, and he had to platoon all these guys, and a lot of the guys were getting old, and he had to platoon, and so he did it by the method he was taught by McGraw, but he wasn't able to use it on the Bees and the Dodgers because there just wasn't any, skill on the team. But if you look, in 1950, the Red Sox were slated to win it just like they were supposed to in 49, and they collapsed the last weekend. But, unfortunately, Ted Williams got, hurt during the All-Star game and missed the rest of the season. I mean, the Red Sox finished 4 games behind the Yankees. If Ted Williams was there, they would have been playing the Whiz Kids in the 1950 series. 51, again, it wasn't such a great run for the Yankees. Mantle came in and was demoted down. DiMaggio was too old and retiring and went down. And they faced a very good Giants team who had come back. And you hear more of the shot heard around the world now than you did of the World Series. And then in 52 and 53, again, the Yankees got lucky because Cleveland was right on their tail, which the Yankees won their most games in 1954 with 103 games, and they didn't even win the pennant because Cleveland won 111 games. So right. they weren't such great teams. And I have the author of the book, Sol Gittleman's been on my show. Lopez, the chief over there, and the Vic Rasky, those three kept them together. But here in 36 to 39, that's the real dynasty. How were the Yankees able to maintain this?
Well, that's when if I remember right, McCarthy's coaching the team then. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And they've got DiMaggio, they've got Gehrig, they got Bill Dickey. They've got a good team, and they're able to draw fans during the Great Depression. One, they're in New York where there's enough fans who have money, and two, with the reserve clause, it's not that expensive to keep players, and they just put together this tremendous string of winners.
And that was the key because they beat the Giants. I think they
beat the Giants twice, 36 and 37.
Yeah.
The Cubs in 38, and who was it in 39? Was it Cincinnati?
The Reds.
I don't remember.
It was the Reds because the Reds would win it in 40.
That's right.
The Reds would win it in 40. Go ahead, Marty. Go ahead.
Yeah, so they had this great team, and it's a different team. I mean, the Yankees had won the pennant in the World Series in 1932, and that was still with Ruth. And now, 4 years later, it's like a different team with but they're starting this new dynasty, and they're dominating again in the second half of the 30s.
And now we get to the 1940s, and of course the Depression's going away, and World War II is lurking around. And one of the things, even before I get to 1941, which was probably, if you and I were alive at the time, it probably would have been something to see between Williams hitting 400 and DiMaggio's 56-game, hitting streak.
Well, one of the greatest seasons of all time.
That's unbelievable. And even before I get to that, I do want to talk about two things. The Zoot, because this is important. During World War II, you had the Zoot Suit riots, and then in January 41, right before the war, about a year before the war for the United States, you had the African-American leader, A. Philip Randolph, demanding integration of the military because he could foresee what's happening. Let's talk about those two incidents.
Yeah, and those are important things about what's happening in America. A. Philip Randolph was a significant labor leader. He was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And, there's still a few porters out there. You see them at the airport or whatever, but it's not a big deal anymore. But before World War II, the way people traveled around the country was by train. And if you were traveling in a passenger train, you would often use a porter to carry your luggage. And porters were the largest employment of African-American men at the time. The railroads were the largest employers of these men, and they were unionized, and A. Philip Randolph was their labor leader. And this is 1940. The U.S. is getting ready to go to war. We're not at war yet. And A. Philip Randolph wants some things taken care of. He wants the military integrated, which military has been segregated since World War I when Woodrow Wilson ordered it segregated. And he wants African Americans working in the defense industry to be treated like white workers. He wants them hired like white workers, paid like white workers, and promoted like white workers. And so in January of 1941, A. Philip Randolph is planning to hold a march on Washington. And the idea of this march literally scares Franklin Roosevelt to death. He's afraid that if there's this huge protest in Washington, D.C., with all these African Americans protesting lack of civil rights, that Adolf Hitler will get photographs of this and descriptions of this, and he will use it for propaganda purposes. And then whenever the United States criticizes Nazi Germany for how Hitler's treating Jews or Gypsies or any other groups of oppressed people, Hitler will say, well, who are you to talk? Look how you're treating African Americans. And so Roosevelt does not want this march to take place. So he summons Randolph to the White House, and he says to him, look, what can I do to get you to cancel this march? And Randolph says, well, you know what my two demands are. And Roosevelt says, well, there's no way I can integrate the military. That can't happen. But what if I do something about the defense industry. And Roosevelt promises to set up the Fair Employment Practices Commission to investigate racial discrimination in the defense industry, making sure that African American workers are hired equally with white workers, paid equally, and promoted equally. And Randolph agrees to accept that. And so he cancels the march. And the March on Washington will not happen for another 22 years. And when the March on Washington happens in 1963, A. Philip Randolph will be the honorary chairman of that march, and it will be viewed as the march that he originally scheduled for January of 1941.
And that's a different president will be there in the office back then.
Yeah, and a different issue. The issue in 1963 was the Civil Rights Act that Lyndon Johnson will sign in August of 1964. This march in 63 was held while that bill was before Congress.
Now, the Zoot Suit riots, and again, if anyone's watched Tom and Jerry, there's an episode, The Zoot Suit Cat. These suits were huge, especially with the fedora and the stripes and the broad shoulders. What's with these riots going on?
Yeah, in the 1940s, Latino men in Southern California had adopted a form of fashion. They wore zoot suits, which I don't know if your listeners are familiar with it. It's spelled Z-O-O-T. These baggy suits, often plaid or striped. They had tight cuffs. They had deep pockets. Latino men also often greased their hair back in pompadours. It was the fashion of the time. But in Southern California, there had been this rise in anti-Latino feeling among people. Newspapers were printing all sorts of sensationalistic stories about crimes involving Latino young men, knifings, gang activity, sex crimes. And so we had this rise of Latino hatred towards Latinos, and we've got a bunch of servicemen in San Diego, sailors and Marines, and these guys would be granted, leave, and they drive up to L.A., and they would start to attack Latino men. They would cut their hair. They would pull their suits off. They would beat them up, and the L.A. cops would look the other way, or if they did get involved, they would often arrest the victim of the attack rather than the sailors and Marines attacking them. And these riots, called the Zoot Suit riots, would spread to several other cities on the West Coast, and they were only stopped when the Department of the Navy ordered all leaves for sailors and Marines stationed in San Diego to be canceled, because it was when these guys would go on leave and they would get drunk that they would start these kinds of incidents. So we had this type of racism against Latinos. We had the racism against African Americans. There was a riot in Detroit in the 1940s during the war. We also, of course, had racism against Japanese Americans. After Pearl Harbor, a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed an executive order ordering people of Japanese descent on the West Coast to be locked up in internment camps in the Rocky Mountain states, and 110,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up and brought to camps because there was this fear among some people that if Japan invaded the United States, what side would these people fight on? Would they fight for the United States, or would they fight for their homeland? And so Japanese Americans are locked up under this. And the ironic thing is one of the main ways people in these internment camps passed the time was by playing baseball, a very American thing to do. They're denied their American identity by the government, but yet they're expressing their American identity by playing baseball games in these camps. But in the camps, these inmates are living under quasi-military discipline. They're behind barbed wire. They're living in barracks. They're eating in mess halls. There's spotlights in watchtowers and spotlights scanning the grounds at night, looking for people outside of their barracks. There was one Japanese American who was a U.S. citizen, a guy named Fred Korimatsu, and he said, "I'm not going. You can't lock me up. I didn't break any law. I'm an American citizen, and he sued. And his case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you have to go because if you're a Japanese American, you're a clear and present danger. And so we have all these different incidences of racism during World War II. And ironically, and we'll talk about this when we get to Jackie Robinson, ironically, World War II is probably the event that leads to both Jackie Robinson entering the major leagues and leads to the civil rights movement. Because what's going on is Americans during the war are fighting for freedom. They're fighting against the Nazis. They're fighting against the fascists. They're fighting against this right-wing military dictatorship in Japan. And it's very clear. It's in all the wartime propaganda. We're fighting for freedom. And people aren't stupid. They recognize hypocrisy. And so Americans are thinking, well, how could we be fighting for freedom in Europe when we're denying freedom to 13 million African Americans, U.S. citizens here in the United States? And so it's during the war that we start to get people saying, wait a minute, we've got something wrong here. It's during the war when the mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, a guy who's got 3 major league teams in his city, starts to say, hey, Major League Baseball, you need to integrate. You cannot keep the color barrier. It's during the war that the state of New York passes the Ives-Quinn bill, a law which makes it illegal for employers to discriminate based on race.
And that's right. That's when they passed that in 1946, it was Branch Rickey who went out and said, well, now, we could do something about it. And he went out and he got Jackie, put him in Montreal. But even before we get to this, the Korematsu case, when I read the case in law school, I was shocked by it because all my favorite justices voted in the dissent. Black, Douglas. They said, well, just like Lincoln in the Civil War, you could suspend habeas corpus. This is a time of war, and the Japanese have been classified, and to put a threat to this country. And so they expanded the whole doctrine of the 14th Amendment, clear and present danger from Holmes as well, saying, hey, they're a clear and present danger. My thing was, well, how about the Italians and Germans? They, too, we were fighting against them, and they end up in camps. So racism at its height.
Exactly, and the case has never been overturned, even to today, by the Supreme Court. And the thing about American history, whenever at war, you always see constitutional rights eliminated. You can go to the Patriot Act, you can go all the way back to Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. This seems to be a part of American history that during war times, the Constitution gets sort of ignored.
I think when we were growing up in the 1960s, especially under Nixon, especially with the gag orders and trying to limit the press, trying to report on Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, Nixon was going to use these powers that were used by not only Franklin Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, but also by McKinley during the Spanish-American War. He was going to limit the press because you're creating a clear and present danger against the government who's fighting a war.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it all draws in line. But let's talk about 1941, the last real year of baseball before the war starts. I know Hank Greenberg had gone into the Army, I think at this point, right before the war. He went in and he served 4 years, but right now we're having a great show between Boston and New York, and also Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and by 1941, the Depression is over. The government is spending so much money preparing for the war that the money's entering the economy, and the economy has improved and unemployment is declining, and baseball is back. Attendance is back to pre-Depression levels. And not only is baseball back because fans can afford to go, but baseball is giving the fans a tremendous season in 1941 in both leagues. In the National League, the Brooklyn Dodgers will win their first pennant since 1920. And in the American League, we've got this amazing competition between Ted Williams of the Red Sox and Joe DiMaggio of the Yankees. Williams is flirting with hitting 400, something that nobody had done since, I think, Mel Ott in 1931 on the Giants. And not Mel Ott, Bill Terry in 1931 on the Giants. And in New York, Joe DiMaggio is getting hit after hit after hit, and he breaks the existing record of 44 straight hits, and then he goes on and he gets hits in the next 12 games, setting a new record for 56 straight games with a hit. He'll be held hitless in Cleveland, and then he'll go out, I think, and get a hit in each of the next 16 games. Now, for DiMaggio, it's nothing new because when he played in the minor leagues in San Francisco for the San Francisco Seals, he had an even longer hitting streak. For Williams, he goes into the last day of the season, a doubleheader in Philadelphia, and he's batting .39999. And the manager of the Red Sox says to him, "Look at Ted, you don't have to play today. I'll bench you if you want, and then you could end the season with a .3999 batting average, which will round up to 400, and so you'll still have this record." And Williams tells the Red Sox manager, Joe Cronin, he says, "Look I don't want to end the season with my toenails on 400. I want to be fully over the line." So Cronin says to Williams, "Okay, I'll start you in the doubleheader." And in the doubleheader, Williams goes 6 for 8, and he finishes the season batting .406. So we got Williams hitting over 400. We got DiMaggio hitting in 56 straight games. And when the season is over, the sports writers have to decide who is the most valuable player in the American League. And that seems to be a tough one for today. And I asked my students this question, who would they have selected for a most valuable player? And it's sort of surprising who they might say. Let me ask you, Ian, who do you think should have been the most valuable player?
Ted Williams, without a doubt.
Why?
Without a doubt, to hit 400, especially not on a great Boston team, where, I think DiMaggio, even if you say that, hey, Joe DiMaggio could have continued the streak for another 16 games because he started a new hitting streak after that, I think hitting that 400 mark in that day and age of baseball where, it's removed 10 years from somebody hitting 400, I think that warrants an MVP. And I think George Brett got it in 1980 for hitting 390. I think he was the closest one to come by the 400 mark since that time because no one else has hit 406. But I'm also in defense of Ted Williams because he lost out on either 3 or 4 more times of winning the most valuable player because he was on the Red Sox. Mantle beat him in 1958, and at 39 years old, he hit 388 Williams. So I think he was the greatest hitter, not the greatest player, because he'll say, if he was still alive, the greatest player he's ever seen was Joe DiMaggio, which is true, but I think the greatest hitter, and this even eclipses Babe Ruth, I think he knew Ted Williams, The Science of Hitting, which was his book. I think he was the greatest hitter, and I think he deserved the MVP award in 1941.
Well, I will have to disagree with you because I think you're making the same perspective a lot of my students make. They look at Ted Williams and they say, nobody has done it since. So it's been a long time, and therefore we should reward this. But you got to remember these voters, these sports writers in 1941, don't know the future. they don't know if somebody's not going to hit 400 again. But they do know that Bill Terry had done it 10 years earlier. So hitting 400 wasn't that rare of an accomplishment in 1941. But nobody had ever hit in 56 straight games. The record was 44, and that was by Wee Willie Keeler way back in 1898. So that was the rare achievement at the time. And so if you just put yourself in 1941 and you think, okay, which accomplishment is rarer, it's obvious that 56 straight games is a much harder accomplishment because somebody had batted 400 10 years earlier. Now, both events have not happened since, so they both are very rare events. And yeah, Williams batted 406, but in 1941, DiMaggio batted 357. He's still hitting very well, and probably most importantly, the Red Sox finished 17 games behind the Yankees. They were out of the pennant race in early September, and so DiMaggio's hitting certainly could be used as a reason to claim why the Yankees won the pennant that year and why they won it by such a wide margin.
I think also DiMaggio was much more popular.
That may be. That may be. Although I'm not sure. I know that there were some people who were upset at Williams in the 50s because Williams had expressed disappointment at being drafted again for the Korean War. I don't know how much of that disgruntled feeling towards Williams was there in the 40s, but there may have been some then too.
Dave, with Williams, because you bring up a great topic, especially, and I think we're going to end it with the MVP race here, and then we'll finish the war next time and the civil rights. The thing is, the year after 41, Williams would win the Triple Crown, and in 47, and in 47, he would do so. He would win the Triple Crown. But I think, for DiMaggio, if you want to lean toward, and I'm a huge Yankees fan, by the way.
I know you are.
I'm living up here in Boston for the last 25 years. And if I was to give it to DiMaggio, it wouldn't only be for his average or for the 56-game winning streak or the fact that the Yankees went to the World Series. It was that he just struck out 13 times.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So he only struck out 13 times. So if I was to give it to DiMaggio, I would give it to him for this. DiMaggio was different than Williams. Williams hated the press up here. The Boston press was so reviled up here by sports players. They were even more meaner than the New York press well into the 1970s. Carlton Fisk came on in 69, and he did something, and I can't remember. And they lambasted him in the papers after he gave an interview innocently. They lambasted Williams for not coming out and speaking to the press because he knew the press would alter his words. And I don't even think he tipped his cap when he hit his last home run in the last game because he was that reviled by the press. All he wanted to do was go fishing. He wanted to be left alone. I mean, that was it, whereas DiMaggio soaked in the limelight. But with DiMaggio, you're dealing with a force that's bigger than Ted Williams, an ego that's much bigger than Ted Williams. Williams was a hero, 2 wars, and not only that, but he had the other 3 with him, Johnny Pesky, Don DiMaggio, and I forget the other one. But they were the original core 4, not the Yankee core 4. DiMaggio, it was like MacArthur. He took center stage. And later on, when he came back to Old Timers Day at Yankee Stadium, which I saw him in 1989, along with
I saw him at Old Timers Day at Yankee Stadium in '69.
Oh, gee. See, but
he was in an Oakland uniform because he was an Oakland coach, but then he wore a Yankee uniform for actually coming to bat during Old Timers game. But I think that's why they scheduled Old Timers Day that year against Oakland, because DiMaggio was a coach on the Oakland coaching staff.
And what people don't realize about DiMaggio, he was a very, very, very private person. He was a womanizer, huge, even more than Mantle. And you find this out in reading about, but when he settled down with Marilyn Monroe and they went on that Far East trip with Lefty O'Doul, she got more attention than he did. And that...
Yeah, and he was annoyed by that. And I think she went to Korea at one point and came back and said to him, Joe, you don't know what it feels like to have 50,000 people cheering your name. And DiMaggio said, yes, I do.
Hey, yeah, you do. Yeah, of course I do. But
have you read David Halberstam's book, The Summer of 49?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's where I got most...
Great book. It came out 25 years ago. But the thing that really caught me in that is, you mentioned DiMaggio as a private person. Halberstam talks about how tense he was, how wound up he was. He was not a comfortable person at all. He was very, very tense and very intense and very, very wound up. And, that's not the image that he portrayed publicly.
No. And even, and baseball players always wondered if Joe was, snubbing him, because he always stayed in the corner in the Yankee dugout and wasn't very friendly with them, would only go out with a small group of collected people. And he kept to himself. He came from a very traditional Italian family who did not, and like my in-laws, they're from Italy, they would never think of baseball as making a living. You have to be in a factory using your hands to making a living. This baseball thing, to them it was foreign. You don't make.
And yet, 3 of their sons played Major League Baseball.
All three of them. And and DiMaggio was the biggest star, mainly because he was a gifted athlete, and he had the nerve in 1938, 2 years after he was a rookie, to boycott spring training and say, well, I don't want to play because you're not paying me. And the Yankee, brass said to him, we didn't even pay Lou Gehrig this amount when he was your age. And he's like, yeah, well, I think you got underpaid then. I'm not Lou Gehrig. And, and he wanted the limelight. And 1 year at Yankee Stadium, they did not say the greatest player ever. When they announced his name, he threatened not to come back. Every time.
This is after he retired for like Old Timers Day and all those other. Yeah, it was in his contract that he would come to all these events, but he had to be introduced as the greatest living baseball player.
That's right. And that's why Joe DiMaggio was like MacArthur. MacArthur fired one of his colonels because he gave an interview to Life magazine without MacArthur's approval. MacArthur had to be the one. He wanted the limelight. He wanted the public image. Both MacArthur and DiMaggio were parallel in their lives, very private, but yet publicly they're going to take the limelight and they're going to take on, the rewards for victory. A personality like that is very detrimental in relationships and dealing with society, because you think you're above society. You're above.
Absolutely.
And that was DiMaggio's fault. So whether I have bias against DiMaggio, because if you ask me who the greatest Yankee player was, of course I'll say Babe Ruth. Who I like the best, Lou Gehrig. But who could have been the greatest Yankee player, Mickey Mantle, if he wasn't drunk. You don't even remember half his at-bats, he later admitted. It was great. Casey Stengel's great disappointment. And if you say Mickey Mantle was a great disappointed, you knew that he could have done better when he was. And Mantle could have been the greatest player ever. Switch hitter, power, if he didn't get injured either. But he was a drunk. And that affected him, especially later on. He
once hit a home run with a hangover. And when he was asked how he did it, he said he swung at the ball in the middle.
That's it. He saw 3 balls coming at him. He swung at the one in the middle. We're going to end the show like this, Marty. Going to come back. Like I said, we're not going to get to civil rights. I didn't expect to. But we're going to finish World War II. We'll go into civil rights. And we'll probably end there, and then we'll pick up with the 50s. And then the 60s, forget it, Marvin Mill, we're going to have our own show on. So I'm anticipating about another 3-4 times you're coming back.
Well, anytime you want me, I'm glad to be on, Ian. I enjoy coming on your show.
And we enjoy having you. Hold the line, and let me finish the show. Folks, I'm telling you, National Pastime, great book. It was nominated for the Seymour Medal, I think you were nominated for this year.
Yeah, I didn't get it, though, so.
No, Gerard Potter, who has had 8 shows on me, and I was the first one to interview him and tell the world that this book is fantastic. He ended up winning, and he's always on my show. We're going to be finishing up the building of Dodger Stadium, but your book is as equally as good. I don't make these decisions. Saber does. But folks, go out, get National Pastime, U.S. History Through Baseball, 2 of my favorite subjects, both United States history, and of course baseball. It's everywhere in Amazon. You can go get it from the publisher, which is where is the publisher? Is it Lowe's? It's Rowan and Littlefield. That's right.
Roman and Littlefield.
And they're looking at my. They're going to be looking at my proposal for the collusion cases in the 1980s. Probably within the next few weeks. The acquisition editor is coming back from maternal leave. So Rowan and Littlefield. I know Dan Levitt, and he's trying to help me get through the door. My first book will be published in October. It's been moved back on Ty Cobb and Trispika. But a lot of good things are happening. Your book's happening, and it's happening on my show. Hey, I'm Ian Kahanowitz, and from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. It's nice to have you back on the show, Marty. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck. We'll see you next time.